Well, hey everybody, welcome back. This is page 98 in your packet, and this is looking at the Civil War amendments, the black codes, and voting restrictions after the Civil War. In the last PowerPoint, we talked about Dred Scott and the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. And so when the Civil War ends, now what? It's been the worst bloodshed in American history. Even to this day, of course, by far, it still holds that uh, distinction. And so the war is now over, though. Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated. The country is thrown into further upheaval because of that. And now what? What's going to happen? Well, let's talk about this time period and let's try to make some sense of this. As the war is wrapping up, and just before Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, he is still around and he wants to make sure that Congress passes the 13th Amendment, which would outlaw slavery and forced servitude in the United States once and for all. Of course, Lincoln had issued his Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and now 2 years later, in 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed. It's recorded for uh, in the history books, and no more slavery or forced servitude. Now all African Americans are free. There had already been some free blacks in the North during the Civil War and before, but in the South now all these former slaves are no longer slaves. They are just that. They are ex-slaves. They are supposed to be free, and so that's what the 13th Amendment does. The 14th Amendment, passed in or ratified in 1868, grants citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the U.S. So, technically, these ex slaves and all free blacks from the Civil War and pre Civil War era should now be citizens. And as such, they are granted due process of law rights. So, if something happens, if they get in trouble with the law or they're accused of something, they're supposed to be given uh, due process, which means they have to go through the same protections, same rights as everybody else. And then equal protection under the law, which is supposed to also be granted at this time to all people uh, in the United States, which says if two people get in trouble for the same thing, basically, they should be treated equally by the law. Should not matter their color, should not matter gender, it should not matter socioeconomic status. Everyone should be treated equally by the law. Now, this last part, this third clause to the 14th Amendment, is going to be huge as time goes on because you will see that as civil rights really gets cranked up in the late 1800s and throughout the 1900s, there will be many lawsuits levied uh, by people in favor of civil rights that are claiming that they're not being given equal protection under the law in any given circumstance. And so uh, this is going to be a huge and basis for most of the civil rights lawsuits that are going to happen for, from the 1860s to the 1960s and even beyond. And so, but that's what the 14th Amendment does. And then the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, says that citizens have the right to vote. And so technically, African Americans all over the United States by 1870 should be able to vote. Uh, the problem was that states who run election laws and run elections in their individual states found ways to deny um, especially black women, the right to vote. And so, and technically white women could not vote yet, and Native Americans could not vote yet, but black men for a short time got the right to vote. And so, with this amendment being passed, black men do get that freedom, uh, only for a number of years, and then states will find ways to prevent them from voting as well. But collectively, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are known as the Civil War Amendments because they were ratified and put into the books in the wake of the Civil War itself, 1865, 1868, and 1870. Now, knowing what you do about the Civil War Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, and the rights that blacks and all Americans should have now after the Civil War, this will this Black Codes idea then will mean more. So what happens is after the Civil War and after all these amendments are passed, new freedoms, new rights should be put on the books for everybody, especially blacks. And Southern states principally found ways around these new freedoms and new rights. They found ways to put the fine print in their state laws that did not enhance or protect African Americans' freedoms, but rather limited their freedoms. So, for example, of a black code, uh, the law itself says that African Americans can sue in court. That's one of their freedoms they have now after the Civil War. They can sue in court, whereas before the Civil War, especially in the South, if a black man tried to sue, it was probably not going to go anywhere. But now they can sue. Well, the black code part of the fine print part of that in the South would be something like, well, the judge and the jury will all be white. And so, what chance does a black man have of a fair trial if the judge and jury are white, and especially former slave owners who are not too excited about having lost their slaves? Another black code would be something like this. The law itself would say that blacks can now travel freely. But the black code is if they want to travel on a train, they have to travel in the baggage car of the train. They cannot actually get a seat uh, like everyone else on the train. They have to travel with the luggage. Okay. Another one, the law says that blacks can now get married to whoever they choose. They have the freedom to marry, whereas as slaves they didn't always have that freedom unless two slave owners sometimes would marry a couple so they could have children and free slaves, right? Free labor. But now they can freely marry. But the black code is that they can only marry other blacks. There will be no interracial marriage allowed. So the black codes really limit blacks' freedoms instead of enhancing them. And this is something Southern states do, and they get away with it. Uh, Washington, D.C. was so concerned about trying to keep the country together and trying to keep riots from ensuing and trying to keep the economy uh, going that they kind of looked the other way, honestly, uh, at these black codes. And also news traveled slow. Okay, there was no internet, no TV, no radio. News traveled slow, and so you weren't always sure if you were in Washington D.C. or somewhere else, especially farther north. You weren't always sure what was happening in the South. But these are the kind of things the black codes did. So basically, they gave kind of an excuse to still mistreat African Americans, deny them their equal rights, and eventually will lead to such things as open and lawful segregation. Well, like I said, black men through the 15th Amendment got the right to vote for a time, not black women, and like I said, not white women for that matter either at the time, but black men did. But eventually, southern states found ways to prevent that as well. And so they used any one or a combination of different clauses and different taxes and different tests to prevent black men from voting. One way they used was a poll tax. A poll tax is, you can see from this receipt there in the top. Um, in Florida, they were still using um, poll taxes as of 1932, if you can believe that. But poll taxes were where you had to pay to vote. Well, voting should be free. You shouldn't have to pay anything to vote, but a poll tax was required uh, by African Americans to be able for them to be able to vote. And so some of them couldn't pay it. And if they couldn't pay it, they couldn't vote. And that was one way to eliminate some of the black man's vote, especially in the South. And let's say they could pay it. Let's say they were fine to pay it. And so then the literacy test kicked in. Well, the literacy test said you had to be able to read and write and answer a bunch of questions, and depending on the state and the county you were in, but uh, literacy tests were really hard. In fact, they'd make these things very difficult, where people who were very literate, people who were very learned, if they had to take it, probably couldn't pass it or would have a hard time at least passing it. And so now you're giving it to ex-slaves in the South who were prohibited by law in most places while they were slaves from being educated. So most of them didn't know how to read and write. They were not literate, and it wasn't their fault. And so, of course, they're not going to be able to pass these literacy tests. Well, that would eliminate almost all of the black vote as well. And some places got even so crazy that they said, okay, well, if a guy could pay a poll tax and then could pass a literacy test, well, the grandfather clause kicks in, which says you cannot vote unless your grandfather could vote. Well, of course, the grandpas couldn't vote of these ex slaves. The grandpas were slaves themselves. And so, I mean, how ridiculous, right? And so, this all but eliminated the black man's vote in the South by the 1880s into the 1890s. Uh, Black man's vote was basically no more. And so, the Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th, for all these protections and all these freedoms that they should have given African Americans, uh, because of black codes, because of these ways to prevent blacks from voting, it wasn't very many years before all these freedoms and rights were nullified by and large. Of course, they didn't go back on the slavery issue. The 13th Amendment stayed, but all the freedoms and protections and rights that blacks should have enjoyed, especially if you lived in the South, you didn't always have those things. And so this was a tough time. But can you imagine? I mean, these three requirements, to be able to vote. It's ridiculous. Now, that picture on the bottom with the grandfather and the kid, probably the grandson, racing, I just couldn't resist. So I put that in for the grandfather clause. So anyway, thanks for humoring me. But this is what's going on here. And you can see that by the late 1800s now, there needs to be a change. Something has to change. Something, and we're reaching a point where African Americans, especially in the South, are going to revolt. And this is no good. They want their freedoms, they want their equalities, and they deserve them. And so things are going to reach a climax here. Something's got to give. And on the next PowerPoint, we'll look at that. But to finish off this one, this now brings up the question: which one of these things at the top of the page, equal protection under the laws or equality of condition, which one is supposed to be guaranteed to all of us? Well, we know the answer. Obviously, it's equal protection under the law, which is symbolized by the scale there on the left. We're all supposed to be treated equally by the law. We're supposed to have the same rights, same freedoms, same protections. And if something happens to us, we're supposed to be treated the same way as everybody else by the law. Now, we know that in practical, realistic terms in the United States today, that doesn't always happen. Obviously, people with money, people with power, people with influence are sometimes treated differently by the law, usually treated much better by the law. But it shouldn't be that way according to the law itself. But by and large, people in this country are, I would say, treated as fairly and as equally as people in pretty much any other country in the world. But I think what some people have misconstrued about this equal protection idea is that some believe that they should be given equal things. And that was never the intention of this law or any other law. We were never intended to be given equal stuff. And so equality of condition, that was never supposed to be the case. some people are just smarter than others. Some people work harder than others. Some people are blessed with a natural ability that other people are not. And we all have our own talents and abilities that we've been given and blessed with, but not everybody is equal in those ways. Some people are born with an ability to, uh, to build things, and other people are born with an ability to develop code for for computer systems. Michael Jordan was was blessed with an ability to play basketball at at a level that few have ever been able to play with or at, and you know I don't have that ability. So you get the idea without belaboring the point, which I probably already have. But I'm not Michael Jordan. Okay, he has abilities I didn't have, I don't have, and I have abilities probably that he doesn't have, and so do you. And so we're not all guaranteed to have a high-paying job, to have a huge house like this one on the right, to have a Ferrari. That's not a guarantee. That's not that was never intended to be that way. But it doesn't mean that we don't have the freedoms and opportunities to try to work and make something great of ourselves. And who knows, we might be able to afford that Ferrari someday. And we might be able to afford that crazy huge house if we work for it. But that's not a guarantee and not protected by the law. But equal protection under the law should be. So hopefully that makes sense. And hopefully now I've inspired you all to work really hard and make your millions, and so you can have a house like this someday. So, and when you do, please invite me over. I'd love to come over and see you. So, anyway, that is that for this PowerPoint. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you later.